Well, welcome everyone. My name is Zach Karanovich. I'm the Graduate Research Assistant here at the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life. I want to welcome you to our first event of the fall. It's really fall day. Some butternut squash soup does not hurt that feeling. Sorry we don't have pumpkin spice anything. Before introducing our guests, I just want to offer a few things. First, we're recording this audio-wise, so if you wouldn't mind making sure your cell phones are silenced. But I'd like to sort of tune you into a few things that are coming down the pike for us. First, next Wednesday, October the 12th, we'll be hosting our second luncheon colloquium featuring Randall Ballmer of Dartmouth College to discuss sports and religion in North America, a theme we're quite familiar with, based on his recently published Passion Plays, How Religion Shaped Sports in North America. The week after that, on Friday the 21st, we'll be welcoming Kate Jackson-Meyer, who's an alumna of the theology department here at BC and currently at Harvard, for her book, Tragic Dilemmas in Christian Ethics, which will be a fascinating discussion, I believe. And then the week following that, on October the 26th in the late afternoon, we'll be hosting a discussion called Two Jewish Fathers Who Changed History, Abraham Joshua Heschel and Elie Wiesel. The event will be quite interesting as their children, Susanna Heschel and Alicia Wiesel, will be discussing their father's legacy, so we welcome you to that as well. For information about these and all of our programs and to register or RSVP, depending on the program, just visit our website, bc.edu/Boise. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to our director, Mark Massa.
Welcome everybody. I'm delighted to see you. The rule at Boise is not only allowed, it's encouraged to get up and get more food, okay? So you won't take that amiss. So
no, not at all.
We're honored to host a star of the faculty here at Boston College. Kristin Peterson is assistant professor in the Department of Communications, and she teaches courses, suspiciously uniformly well-praised courses related to the intersections of media and religion. She earned her doctorate in media studies from the University of Colorado at Boulder, where she was also a research fellow for the Center for Media, Religion, and Culture. Her research focuses on religious expression in digital media, specifically examining how young people engage with online media sites, images, videos, creative projects as spaces to develop religious meaning. Her book, hold it up, the fetish as a result of a long research project on how digital media spaces facilitate intersectional feminist activism within evangelical Christian and Muslim American communities. We are delighted, so welcome, Kristin.
Thank you very much. I think I'll stand so everyone can see me a little better. I can see you all a little bit better. Usually I like to stand to move around. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you to Father Mark Massa, Zach, Susan for kind of coordinating everything. Thank you all for coming. So I wanted to start off this discussion today by looking at these two images. And really kind of how I became interested in thinking about evangelical Christianity and Muslim Americans and thinking about digital activism. So I noticed these two similar kind of critiques being voiced online among evangelical Christians and Muslims around what's known as modesty culture or purity teachings. And so you see these two images. On the top you have this image of a flower that's sort of lost all of its petals. And this is often used within the purity culture to symbolize, particularly women's sexuality and this idea that if you lose your virginity before marriage, you're kind of like this flower that's lost all of its petals. There's similar lessons around, your piece of chewed up gum, your a piece of scotch tape that's kind of stuck to so many people that it's lost its stickiness. And then this image here is a meme that's very common among Muslims, and this idea that if you're wearing the hijab, you're kind of like this covered up lollipop. You're protected from what you see in the right-hand image of, flies attracted to you, right? And so in both of these cases, women, and particularly their sexuality, is being objectified, and women kind of become the bearers of sexual purity for this whole community. And so when instances of abuse occur within these communities, which they have, and you can look at things like Church 2, what's happening now within the SBC Church, you can look at Mosque Me Too, there's various stories of abuse and harassment. But when these things occur, what often happens is the women are still sort of blamed and shamed for the sexual indiscretions that happen. So I started to be interested in how only certain women kind of can become these bearers of sexual purity for the communities, and kind of become the modest icons of the faith. And so I was also thinking of who's left out of this? Who are the people who are kind of the unruly souls? The people who, because of who they are, because of their sexuality, their race, they're kind of seen as impure. and also thinking about like what's the harm that's done in these cases. So these projects really relate to larger activist work that we can see going on within society. So we can look at, Me Too and Black Lives Matter and some of these movements. But what I wanted to explore in this book is the way religious identity adds another layer to digital activism. And specifically thinking about this deep spiritual pain that's caused by being labeled as somehow impure or unruly. And thinking about, the work that does, right? Beyond just simply talking about discrimination. So thinking about how there's this added trauma of having religious leaders justify these things through religious language. So this idea to be taught that you're kind of inherently created impure or wrong. So because I'm a scholar of digital media, I'm basing most of this work on what's going on in terms of contemporary media and how this can be a space for these critiques and also a space for creating supportive communities. So you're probably familiar, there's a lot of debate around digital media and how this could be a space for political activism. So you have critiques about, it's just a space for kind of selectivism. It's just a space to kind of circulate content, to like things, to share things, but it doesn't actually lead to real change. Or there's kind of this idea that, everyone has a voice, but who's listening, right? Like, how can you get your voice to kind of come through the cacophony of voices? And then there's also concerns about, the larger political economic forces that are in control behind a lot of these spaces and whether these critiques really matter that much. And so you have kind of a lot of these critiques going on, and really the way I position myself is thinking about digital media as an important space for individuals, especially those who've been marginalized, to kind of see themselves and feel themselves as part of a political project. To really see that their individual experience of oppression relates to these larger structures. And so thinking about how that can be a space to kind of motivate people into offline larger activism. And then also thinking about, a lot of scholars talk about how digital media is one tool. It's not the whole thing, right? So political activism isn't only happening in this space, but it's one aspect of this work. And then the other thing that I do is I'm engaging with digital media, but then I'm adding work from queer theory, decolonial theory, Black feminist theory, intersectionality, to think about how those who've been marginalized have long kind of used these kind of innovative opportunities to resist through various tactics. So then building on these theories, I'm looking at the way that young people who've been can kind of deploy this status that they have of unruly souls and kind of lean into this and lean into the hybridity, the malleability of digital spaces as a way to build up a new religious understanding centered on this idea of their equality in the eyes of God. So that's kind of where I ended up in terms of the overall argument. So to look at a few of the, kind of go through the chapters and kind of talk about the examples, and then I can't cover everything, so if there's questions or things that come up, we'll talk about that at the end. So in each chapter, I look at a different media space, and I look at a different religious expression. And then the conclusion, I kind of bring them together. So in the first chapter that I look at Twitter conversations, textual spaces, and look at the purity culture. So if people maybe are familiar a little bit with this culture, but this is kind of the dominant sexuality teachings within evangelical Christianity, beginning around the 90s. So people who kind of are coming of age now, in their 20s, 30s, were most likely exposed to this culture. And so this is one of the prominent books, Kiss Dating Goodbye, which sold like over, I think, 1 million copies or something. Very, very prominent. And within purity culture, there's just generally the idea of like maintaining purity until marriage, and the idea that this even goes so far, as you can see here, of not dating, not kissing, not holding hands, none of those things. And so the tenets of purity culture are actually really promoted through text, through these books, through speaker series, through pledges, things like that. And so what I argue in this chapter is that because these ideas almost become like doctrine within this community, that to use the textual space of Twitter to kind of counteract that, to engage with this text that's been used to kind of shame these individuals, to like re-articulate, to sort of show and celebrate their sexuality. So with Twitter, you can think about the kind of the humor around Twitter, right? So this is a tweet, I kissed straighting goodbye. And this guy, Matthias Roberts, he's also featured in the book talking about the Queerology podcast. And so you can see here how, yes, this is funny, but a lot of what he's doing is he's using the language, right? And so there's I work with this concept of disidentification, which comes out of queer theory, but this idea of like engaging with the text, but reading it in a way that's counter to the meaning of it. So using this textual space that is really prominent, I kissed dating goodbye, and changing that and using it in a different way to celebrate his sexuality. And so I look at this a lot in this chapter of thinking about how these individuals use this language of shame and use it in a new way. These are a couple of the conversations that I looked at. So these happened in 2016, so a bit ago. But you can see even just from the images, they're responding to the prominence of the I kissed dating goodbye with the hat, as you can see here, right? And then also you see kiss shame bye. So playing on the I kissed dating goodbye again, right? And so in these spaces, we can look at the way, and there's a lot of examples, and I should mention I changed the wording slightly for the book to kind of protect this kind of private space that's created here. But to think about how a lot of these critiques are talking about, that this is a space that really promotes, cisgender, straight, white individuals, that this is promoting this idea that, sex is shameful, that your body is shameful. And so in these posts, people are doing is sort of re-articulating this idea that this great shame has been done, but that they're trying to work out of this in different ways. But you can see the harm and trauma that's been caused by this culture in these tweets. And this is an example. This wasn't from the Twitter hashtag, but this was another project that a woman named Linda K. Klein did, and she has a larger book about this as well, where she had people kind of fill out these anonymous, or you just have her first name there, postcards about their experience. And I'll read this to you. So it says, "The religious community in which I was raised taught me my body, and my use of it was dirty sexual wrong. But my God, my relationship with him taught me that I am fearfully and wonderfully made in his image. God is love, and so am I, love for others and love for me, love embodied and enacted, physical love and emotional love. Love is not defined by gender or sexuality, and neither am I." And what I think is really interesting in this is that she's really engaging with these ideas and these textual and this theology in order to express her value, right, and pride in who she is, and this idea that all individuals are created in the image of God. And so she's explaining that God is about love and forgiveness rather than shame, sinfulness, and worthlessness. And an important point, she says, sexuality and gender expression do not exist apart from God's love, but are intrinsic to one's being. I think that's really, really essential. Okay, so to shift tracks, in the next chapter, I'm shifting to looking at images and looking at the space of Instagram and looking at Muslim Americans. And so within, American Islam, there's not this extensive purity culture that there exists within evangelical Christianity, but there is a really dominant idea of what it means to be modest. And often this is perpetuated through Muslim fashion. And this is also pushed forward within Instagram, within influencer spaces. And so if you do a search for like Muslim fashion, most likely you'll find images like this. And you see kind of, it's like this pastel, flowing, light complected women, very beautiful, right? Very attractive, thin women. And so you have kind of this dominant image that Muslim women should be sort of seen and not heard, just kind of this beautiful representation of the religion. And in this chapter, I look at 4 different women who kind of in their own way are trying to counteract this, right? So each of these women actually has pretty successful Instagram accounts. So they're engaging with the kind of stylistic expectations of Instagram, but they're doing it in a way that is kind of counter to this kind of pastel aesthetic, right? So someone like Leah Vernon, who's been around for a while, she identifies as a fat black Muslim woman, and her work is really kind of inserting her body, inserting her bold style into this space. And she actually coined this term pastel influencers, Islamic influencers, and talks about how they're carefree, they travel to Dubai, and have these beautiful husbands and families and stuff, right? And so she talks about like the discrimination she faces. She talks about political issues. She's actually one of the few influencers who talks about like how she makes money and like how it's like a struggle to do this work. And then we have Angelica Lindsay Ali, who goes under the name The Village Auntie, and she has this really beautiful kind of like motherly, matronly space where she shares sexuality teachings based in Islam. And also she celebrates the beauty of black bodies, the beauty of bodies of different sizes. And then this is by Zainab bint Yunus, and she's an interesting person because she does a really distinct work on Instagram. She actually mostly just posts book reviews, which is a pretty popular thing now on Instagram. And she'll do these like beautifully composed images of the books along with her kind of her domestic space. She also will post, baked goods and beautiful pictures of her houseplants and her prayer space and stuff. And so she's actually niqabi, so she wears the face veil. So she never really, obviously doesn't take pictures of her face, but she doesn't also take a lot of pictures of herself at all. And so what I argue in this section is thinking about how she kind of engages with this idea of mimicry, which is Homi Bhabha came up with this concept, but this idea that she's kind of engaging with the expectations of Instagram. Like her pictures are very beautiful and comforting, but what she's actually doing is sort of celebrating this Islamic beauty, right? It's contrary to kind of a Western focus on like consumption and appearance. And then Blair Imani, maybe people have heard of her because she's probably one of the most popular on here. She does a lot of work to kind of promote progressive political causes. So thinking about how each of these women kind of counter these expectations that Muslim women should be these beautiful but silent icons of the faith. Okay. All right, going through these quick, and then we can have conversations. So this next chapter, I look at podcasts, which was kind of an exciting exploration for me because I've been wanting to talk about podcasts for a while. And within the kind of former evangelical Christian questioning community, podcasts are really prominent. So you have these podcasts, Exvangelical, Queerology, The Liturgists, and they're very different, but they have a similar idea of like having this open space to kind of talk about issues. And I think about how they engage with authenticity and intimacy, and how this is a medium that really, allows for that. And how in the spaces they can have these really deep conversations about faith and faith journeys. And podcasts like The Liturgist, they actually do more of like a ritual where they have a space where they can talk about different topics and have different voices. And then I also look in this chapter and I focus mostly on this podcast called Truth's Table. It's hosted by these three women here who are all Black Christian women who are educated, theologically educated. And they use this space as kind of the space of dialogue, right? And I talk about how they build up and kind of revalue Black women's lives. And so thinking about how these women are, obviously they're left out of white Christian spaces, they're left out of Black Christian spaces because of their identity. And so they kind of use this to create what Lisa Flores calls this discursive space of your own. And so the podcast is called Truth's Table. So they use this idea of pulling up a seat at the table. And they often talk about like sipping tea. So bringing your cup of tea to the table, joining the podcast, and developing this space of dialogue. And Bell Hooks talks about dialogue being this kind of powerful space for Black women to speak back to the way that they've been, discussed and talked about. There's a lot of really fascinating work in this podcast. One example is from an episode that's called Strange Fruits. So if you want to kind of dip your toe into this podcast, this is an excellent one. And they're talking about, the whole episode is about Black death and looking at police brutality. And they talk really powerfully about the way that white supremacy is entrenched within American Christianity to the point that whiteness becomes this idol of worship. And this is a really interesting space, and I think of it as kind of almost like a ritualistic space where they're able to really revalorize their lives. And so at the end of the episode, they each kind of read different, they read the Strange Fruits poem, and then they talk about, they read some of the names of the victims, and then they kind of offer these prayers. And one of the things that one of the hosts, Kebony, says, I think is really powerful, where she says, "We don't value Black life in this country. It angers me to no end because we are made in the image of God. That's why we really have to derive our worth from the scriptures, from Jesus Christ himself. Because the state ain't going to give it to us, the media ain't going to give it to us, the church isn't going to give it to us." So again, this idea that they need to do this work, this podcast is so essential of a space for them to engage with the scriptures, with the teachings in order to show their value. Okay, so this is a chapter we can get into looking at a few visual images, a few videos. The last chapter I look at digital music videos and kind of the space of hip hop. And think about how hip hop is kind of this layered space, and how, particularly for Muslim Americans, it can be a really valuable space because for a lot of Muslim Americans, they're kind of caught in this kind of third culture experience, right? They kind of have they're kind of caught between these different pressures from both sides. And so I explore in this chapter like the work about early female hip hop artists who in the like 80s and 90s and had similar pressures. Like they couldn't actually like find, they were sort of told that they were being too sexualized, or they were told that by the men they were facing a lot of misogyny. So there was like no way that they could kind of articulate who they were. And so within hip hop, it kind of is this good productive space. And so for Muslims, they look at like how they're using this space not just to like respond to like the kind of Islamophobic tropes, but actually what they're doing is like they're kind of celebrating their culture. They're thinking about how they can imagine this future free from a lot of these stereotypes. Okay, so Mona Hayder's work, probably people have seen this video, heard, so we won't look at this one, but this is her first video, Hijabi, Wrap My Hijab, which has over like 8 million views, very popular, a very catchy song. But what's interesting is, I talked to her about this, and she said, it wasn't like responding to stereotypes. She actually saw this video as like an anthem. She saw this as a statement of pride for Muslim women and a statement of unity. And this idea that the song says, women of all shading, women covered or not, of all body shapes. So it was meant to be this kind of anthem. And if you look online, like there's a lot of digital spread of this, like memes and quotes from it, right? The other video that she does, and I do want to look at a little bit of this, is called Dog. And this one is kind of responding to critiques and issues within the community. And so this is talking about the kind of hypocrisies of Muslim men who are abusive to women. And so we'll look at like maybe a minute of this, and then we can talk about it. Hopefully it will work okay.
If you think this song is about you, I don't know what to tell you. Sheikh's on the DM, Sheikh's in my DM, begging me to shake it on my cam in the PM. Sheikh's on the DM, Sheikh's in my DM, riding in the Addy like a Saudi Arabian. A teacher, a guru, oh you just some doodle. Stand out on the whole soup, but you just a produce. Boy you ain't got no juice, boy you drop a oku. Too little for your ego and I cannot give you no boost. Say my voice is hot on, cause you getting turned on. Boy you waiting to put on, boy you need to turn down. Got my full hood on, got my full hood on. Something but a soda, got my full hood on. See them flashy CDs in their city suits. Koofy turbans and the prayer beats are rocking to Twitter, Insta, hear those howls. When the sun sets, tryna hunt me down. You can see my spirit, but you're a dog in me. You can see right through him, he's a dog, 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 he's a dog. Oh, you need to be her. Come, you got a wife, and we can win this cookie. He's a dog, 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 he's a dog.
So as you can see, if you picked up the lyrics, I have a few of them here, but I think what's really interesting in this video is the way she uses humor and uses the ability of hip-hop music to kind of have this layering, right, and to kind of mix and blend. And in particular, she also like adds certain Arabic phrases, mostly because they have better flow, right, to the song. And so it's a nice way of kind of bringing these things together. So you can see here, like Sheikh's in the DL, Sheikh's in my DM. And then thinking about, I really like these parts here, like a teacher, a guru, you're just some doo-doo, right? Said you own the whole souk, but you just sell produce, right? I think what's interesting is like she doesn't really, I don't think, care at all about these things, right? But she knows what's gonna poke at these men, right? What's gonna like cause them to get upset, right? And then she has these things about work at Chuck E. Cheese and stuff later on. But what's interesting with this is she's engaging with humor in a way that is still biting, it's still biting critique, but it's not re-traumatizing the people who are victims. It's a really clever way to do this. And it's also celebrating the women's power. The other video that I wanted to look at from hers is called Barbarian. And this is, I think, a really great illustration of that tactic of mimicry that I talked about, and also this idea of re-articulation. So the sense of like, there's certain labels that get applied to certain bodies, like Muslims, and so thinking about how they can do this work to celebrate the things that have been kind of denigrated. And so in this video, we'll look at this, and you'll get the idea of this. So, I'll play it for you.
more civilized, I'd rather stay savage. We them barbarians, beautiful and scaring them, earth shaking, rattling, be wild out loud again. We them barbarians, jasmine and frankincense, feminine invading them, beautiful barbarians. Say it again, beautiful barbarian. Say it again, beautiful barbarian. Beast before now, they wanna be wearing our skin. We don't let them win, we beautiful barbarians. Let me think back, I remember days on these big lips. Oh, they used to hate, now the script lit. Oh hey, they got a lip kit. Kylie J, 100 real top, that's what I'm on. If I'm a savage, then you're a fraud. My chain's off, won't be long. See me glowing, look at God. So fresh and so eloquent, I keep it humble and elegant, your beauty standard irrelevant, our revolution is so imminent, we keep it joyful and better when I see my mama as evidence, nobody needs your benevolence, what? Feminist planet is imminent,
Okay. Go back to that, but I don't want to start. Okay, great. And so in this video, you can see she's visually celebrating these stereotypes that get applied to denigrate Muslims, right? Savage, barbarian, Orientalist. And at the same time, she's pointing to the flaws in Western Euro-American culture, right? And in the song, in the written commentary, she's very, very clear, right? She's questioning who's a real savage, right? Who's the one who's really a barbarian when these are the things that Western powers do. A kind of similar project, I don't want to start the video, is from this project called Alhamdu, which is by the Mipsters. And the Mipsters kind of came to be prominent about 10 years ago when they did this fashion video. But in this project, they're trying to do more of like a multimedia project. So it has fashion, it has art, this video, the music to it as well. I don't think we'll look at this video, but it kind of has this like layering effect. Again, you kind of using the way hip hop music allows for the layering of lyrics and music, and so they're bringing together, really illustrating this third culture, right? Bringing together their culture from their parents, from Islam, and then they're bringing that in with American culture as well. And you can kind of see here in this image, like it's just this like really bold, bright, colorful, and similar to Barbarian, really embracing the kind of Orientalist stereotypes. And in their work, they were trying to kind of articulate this idea of Muslim futurism, the sense of, if you're familiar with Afrofuturism, this idea of like imagining a future that breaks free from all these labels and binaries and the restrictions of that, right? So thinking about what it means to be, what the future is like built on a Muslim perspective. Okay. So a few concluding thoughts, and then we can kind of have a conversation. So in the conclusion, I kind of think about like how there is like intersection that we can see happening within these projects. So we can think about how like you have Church Too, you have Mosque Me Too, you have these projects to root out abuse, patriarchy within these communities. You have some projects looking at anti-blackness within these communities, homophobia as well. So you have actual activist projects and works and things that are being done. But then also thinking about the other things that are happening in these spaces that come out of this work. And so thinking about how, for a lot of these individuals, that there's a need to have a healing space, right? This was something that came up in almost all of my conversations with people, that there's a need for this kind of healing from this trauma. And I think especially, like I said, because these are religious teachings, there's like a deeper trauma that's caused by being told that you're kind of inherently wrong. And also there's a very niche experience, particularly like within the evangelical community. They talk about how this is like a subculture, right? They're raised within this culture, and when they start to question or leave it, it's like, what's the community for them, right? And so that there needs to be some of these spaces for this work. And then I think about how a lot of these projects are really building up a faith that centers on the value of unruliness, right? That you could look at some of these movements like the Mipsters movement, some of the podcasts, the Truth's Table, the Liturgists, the ex-evangelical movement, how these are movements that build out of these media spaces, but become a space that people are not just thinking about gender, sexuality, and race and considering that, but actually thinking like, how can we radically rethink faith centered on these ideas? So that's really kind of where I came from, of thinking about how this work is doing really important work in the communities to call out these problems and injustices, but also thinking about these spaces as really important spaces for healing and important spaces for kind of rethinking faith centered on these ideas of queerness and unruliness. So that's what I have for now. Look forward to conversation.
Kristin, can I ask
Yes,
you a question?
of course.
You said something sort of counterintuitive that kind of surprised me. You mentioned early on that Muslim women didn't seem to have the same emphasis on sexual purity as evangelicals.
Less of a established like culture. Do you know what I mean? Because what Linda K. Klein actually talks about it as a purity industry. Like there's an entire, books and speaker series and things like that. Yeah. So within Islam, there's less of that, but there's still an emphasis on that. Yeah, that's good to clarify. Does that make sense?
No, that makes sense. I was just wondering if that's related to American perceptions of Muslims after 9/11, or was that always?
I think. Well, I would say probably it's mostly related to evangelicals just being more adept at using culture, right? In lots of ways, like in popular culture, and then I think potentially just Muslims being kind of a minority and a bunch of different minorities and very like heterogeneous, so that there's less of like a uniting around like a common text like you have in the I Kiss Dating Goodbye. But certainly these ideas are promoted for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have sort of two questions,
Yeah,
and
great.
you can take one or the other. One is you talk about unruly religion, but you also call them religious misfits. What is the connection? Is there a connection with the establishment religion with these movements? It seems that they're operating pretty much outside. Is there a connection someplace?
Yeah, well, I think in both cases there's less of like an institutional religion in the sense of like the Catholic Church, or most of these are evangelical, so there's less of like a denominational affiliation. But yeah, I would say that there isn't necessarily a response to a specific institution, but sometimes there is like calling out specific, like with the SBC, what's going on right now with that. But yeah, and I think in some ways that's a bit of why there's a lot of issues, because within evangelicals, within Islam, there isn't like an overall institution to address when you have like abuse. So like a person can move around and there's nobody saying, oh, that person was abusive and harassing in this community. You know what I'm saying?
Congregation.
Right, in this congregation. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. My other question was, and I'm just forgetting it now, I'll come back to
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, Mike?
My question follows a bit. Thank you so much
Yeah.
to hear your work again. My question a little bit follows from Mark's question a second ago, which is, I wonder where the sexual ethic lands out of all of this, right? Because it seems as though one thing that these folks are doing across the different cases is they're trying to reestablish some agency vis-a-vis their identities having been marginalized within the religious traditions. And I see that at work. But where does that then land on the question of sexual ethics? Like, do the those who don't identify as cis and straight in the responding to the I Kiss Dating Goodbye, do they still see chastity as a value to preserve? The women who are in the music videos are still hijabbed up, right? Do they still see sexual chastity something to observe? So where does it kind of land with regard to that as the identity becomes empowered, but are they still clinging to traditional sort of sexual ethics?
Well, I guess there's maybe two things, right? Because do you mean chastity in terms of like not having sex?
Yeah, but roughly. I mean, that's sort of what seems like they're responding to.
I think there's a few things. I mean, I think one is they desire to have agency. So I think that's kind of the key thing. So that that there's an agency to choose how they would like to cover themselves. So some people might choose to maintain, like within Islam, like Zainab bin Yunus, who I talked briefly about, she's a niqabi. She's very, very modest, but also like because I did work on her for my dissertation, and like I was in a conversation with her and some of her friends, and they talk about sexuality is really important, like, you know, having sexual freedom within marriage, right? So that I think the big issue they have is that because of these teachings, they really don't teach them how to be an agentive sexual being, right? They just tell them that sex is bad, and then when you get married, it'll be great. But they don't actually teach them how to, like, anything about sexuality. I mean, Angelica Lindsay Ali is the one who, she teaches about Islam and sexuality. So sex itself is not bad, but the problem is that in a lot of these spaces, they're just taught sex is bad, don't have sex, but when you get married, sex will be great. And they're sort of saying, well, like, how do you do, you know, like, they don't even know how to, you know, how to have sex that's pleasurable and that is going to be, you know, mutually pleasurable and beneficial for a couple. So I think there is certainly a need for that, right, to have some sort of sexual ethic. And within Islam, there actually, I feel like there's more teachings around that I've come across of, like, how to have, like, a sexual ethic within marriage. Within Christianity, I think in some ways there's less of that, right? I don't know if other people know of teachings that are relevant. But yeah, I think that's definitely something that is a need. But I think overall what they're desiring is agency and an ability to have sexuality that isn't shame-based, that's like celebrating. And there's also really good, like, Emily Joy, who's the one who started the Church 2 movement or involved with that. She's a really excellent book where she basically explains how Church 2 was created, and the abuse is because of this purity culture, because it's like promoting this unhealthy sexuality. Yeah. I don't know if that answered exactly.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, Eric.
Thanks so much for
Yeah,
talking.
thanks.
I'm excited to see your book. Two things. One, I do think there's a pretty substantial cottage industry of Christian sexuality books out there. I'm not reading them, and I don't, you know, I can't give you authors or anything, but in listening to people like Keith Bowler and others talk about sort of younger generation evangelicals and within the church, she talks about that to some degree, and I don't know. It'd be interesting to hear more about. But more directly to your talk, you had really interesting research you're showing about Muslim feminists and digital activism and Christian feminists and digital activism. I wonder, in the sort of religious political landscape and these are mostly in the U.S., right? And mostly in the American religious political context, we see a lot of interfaith connectivity across lines or interdenominational connectivity where the solidarity is around conservatism or progressivism or whatnot. I'm wondering if you could say a word about the sort of interfaith digital activism that's not either Christian or Muslim, but acting in some ways either for a strategic end or out of solidarity or out of some other connectedness.
So one thing I would say is that several people when I talk to people, mentioned things going on in, mentioned, like this, like Matthias Roberts talked about what Mona Hayter was doing, and like, so they're very aware, Mosque Me Too, Church Too, they're very aware of like these conversations that are happening and supportive of those other spaces. But then there is a movement called Queer Youth of Faith. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's a newer movement. So there are some things like that are kind of springing up. But I would say generally what I found was that because people were starting, especially under the Trump administration, young people were starting to, obviously be very politically active. And so there might be, he was kind of like going after all these different groups, right? But then I think people started to realize like, oh, actually there's a larger system of oppression. So people were starting to show up, to a rally for immigration, show up for a thing for Muslims because they knew that like this was this larger structure. So I started to kind of see the way that young people were really already kind of collaborating and kind of aware of these things of like, oh, like we also need to think about what's happening in the Muslim community and various other communities. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was really educational. I'm curious how much you think these digital spaces, clearly they have created a possibility for liberative potential for the women who are exercising different forms of agency in them. I'm also curious whether within either of these kind of established norms, there's groups that are responding in those digital spaces that have their own kind of responses, and if that's the case, what do you think, or is there something that's unique in these digital spaces that's allowing both conversations to be happening? that's unique.
So you're asking whether there's like the institutions are responding.
Yeah, or even groups of women that are like, I love purity
Yes.
culture. Like, you're wrong. I mean,
Right, yeah, totally. Yes, you definitely see that. So yeah, a few things I would say. One is I just read this article about how there's like purity culture 2.0 now, which is like on TikTok and on Instagram. There's a lot of like married influencers who are like, and it's really interesting because before it was like, you know, don't have sex because, especially like I remember growing up, it was like, you're going to get AIDS, you're going to get, you know, all these things. And, you know, it's really dangerous and it's going to be really bad for you. But now they're saying, don't have sex because then if you wait, your sex will be like amazing, you know? And so there's like these very like attractive couples that are like, we waited and it was amazing, you know? So it's like a very different interpretation of it. And and so I think that's a bit of the pushback, and it really fits into this like influencer culture of like, everything's perfect and beautiful and wonderful and we have these beautiful children and, right? So you have that. I mean, you certainly have, so yeah, I mean, obviously like the institution is like, I think it was Emily Joy who said like they're constantly trying to wrest control of these things away from the activists. So you certainly have the institutions trying to counteract that. But I think you're right. You definitely have people who are sort of trying to think about and articulate different ideas around it. But you also just have like a huge, if you look at Islam, I mean, you're not mostly seeing these women, you're seeing the kind of general, you know, pastel aesthetic. The other thing I should mention too is that it's kind of interesting, but like Zainab was very critical of Leia. Like she really does not like her stuff because she finds it very sexual. And so you have critiques within those communities as well. Yeah. Does that answer it a bit?
Does, yeah.
But yeah, you definitely have this like very active debates and discussions going on in these spaces, for sure. Yeah.
Thanks, Chrissy, for your talk. It was great. I saw a lot of that play out this summer with, as it relates to the Duggar family. Very prominent family based in, evangelical family based in Arkansas that has, to a great degree, utilized, you know, various forms of media to elevate their family, their life, etc. And then the fallout with their oldest son, Josh, who you know, was found guilty of many counts of child pornography, and his wife Anna. Sort of what unfolded from both sides, somewhat. Some people in full support of her continuing to stay with him, and to your earlier point, she knows no other culture. This is the culture in which she was raised, in this very devout purity culture, and almost, you know, some comments were almost implying that had she made, and this is a term that you see often in this space, had she made herself more joyfully available to Josh, he wouldn't perhaps have acted on his
she's the problem.
urges. So she was being blamed within this space, and, you know, of course, then other people coming, you know, at the evangelicals so hard for not supporting her and, you know, providing her a different opportunity or chance to like leave and carve out a different life for herself and her 7 children.
Yeah, I know, that's a great example. Yeah, exactly, this idea of like, who's to blame for this? Is the women are the ones who are
right.
in some
like
ways.
It's like she bears the, you know, burden, responsibility for the decisions that he made over and over and over again.
Yeah, that's a really good example of that. Yeah, Lisa.
Well, it kind of connects up with the question that I was thinking about, which is, I mean, I love your approach of asking the question of who are these unruly souls, and I'm kind of curious if you could say more, if you think that radicalization is a sort of centrally important to this overall project, and to the extent that it is important, where do you see the through lines of radicalization for these women who feel now that they need to speak out?
So you're saying
is certainly one of them.
You're saying they're coming from a radical
if you think that some of the speakers who you analyze, the unruly souls, are radical in the sense that they are moved to urgently critique the dominant narrative or dominant discourses.
Oh yeah, I was thinking like radical terrorists or something.
No, didn't mean that.
Yeah, do I think they're radical? Yeah, I think definitely what they're doing is trying to really, what I think is really radical about what they're doing is the way that they're trying to really kind of address that the problem is not with them, but within these institutional spaces, and the way that they're trying to actually like bring it back to these teachings, you know, like these ideas that they've been taught that are central to the faith, right? To actually like radically say like, well, what if we think about Christianity as like a queer space? If we think about how Jesus was kind of like a queer figure who was not human or divine, right? Or like these kind of the radical teachings of like, you know, being among the marginalized. Or if you think about within Islam, like there's radical teachings around, you know, serving the poor and like kind of justice, right? So I think that's one of the ways where I'm not sure if this exactly answers the question, but I feel like they are really doing this important work to sort of not just say like, oh, we've been harmed, but to say like, you are the one that is incorrect, and this is the way that you are incorrect. You know, you are the one who, as you know, as Mona says, like, if you're a savage, I'm a fraud. Like, you're the one that is misinterpreting these things, and that's where I definitely see the radical aspect of what they're doing. Yeah.
I'm going to do something you're not supposed to. I'm going to triangulate. I went to the end of last year, and the convener of a very interesting podcast with 3 Muslim scholars about training Muslim leaders in the United States. And one of the things that came up there that surprised me was that there's a racial cast to this, that Arab Muslims tend not to completely value African American Muslims.
Right.
Do you want to say anything?
No, and you touch on that actually in your book.
Yeah.
And do you see that within these communities, or do you see them separate so that the Arab Muslims, that's sort of the pinnacle, and if you're Southeast Asia, if you're black, you're less than? Yeah,
you definitely see that, and that's where I was getting at this idea of like, I feel like the movements are very interconnected. So like the young people, the young Muslims are saying like, Black Lives Matter isn't just a white American society problem, it's also a problem within our communities as well. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the Leah Vernon talks a lot about that. Like, she talks about how, you know, like sometimes Black Muslims are called like abd, which is like slave, you know, in Arabic, or, you know, they receive a lot of discrimination. They're you know, maybe not as offensive. Oftentimes they're assumed to be converts. They're assumed not to know that much.
Right.
But they may not be, you know, they may know a lot. And then more extreme, they're sort of seen as less holy, like that they're not as at the same level, right? Even though that's not, you know, in the Quran, in the tradition.
But you see interaction among those groups, because in terms of feminist theology, the groups were extremely distinct: white, black, Latinx, you know, very different groups. Is there more crossover here?
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, just in general, like I feel like a lot of these activists are very aware of intersectionality, so they're very aware that it's not just a women's issue, but it's, you know, a racial issue as well, and other intersections. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. See, what distresses me is the brutality in Islam. This young woman of 20, her headscarf was not in the right place. They beat her to death.
Yeah, I think what's really, I've been impressed in looking at the kind of discussions around this, you know, this idea that it's not the headscarf, you know, like there's been images of like an older mother with her daughter protesting, and the mother is wearing a headscarf and the daughter is not. It's about the agency, right? So it's about what people choose to do and having that agency. So not being forced to wear it, not being forced to take it off, right? To being able to have that ability to decide what you'd like to do, right?
Well, see, there's a total absence of, and Eric would help us, of human rights, and there's no freedom or human rights, there's nothing. Yeah. So who makes these decisions? The clerics of Iran? I mean,
yeah, so it's obviously, you know, would be told to be a misinterpretation or interpreting. You know, it's like similar, I think, in the U.S. context, where you have kind of Christian nationalism, which you can see many critiques of why that's not based in the Bible, but people still claim that it's Christian, right? It's kind of a similar idea of like saying it's Islam, but it seems pretty contrary to a lot of Islamic teachings. It seems to be about power and control.
Which, there's no question.
Yeah.
See, the thing is, I was told by Islamic scholars that they're not distorting the Quran, they're carrying it out. And that Islamic people who are, and I have many friends in that community, who are sane, whatever word you want to use, they ignore the Quran these folks carry it out. And Father Daly told me it must be reformed. It must be. You have to get to the roots of this thing because it's so unfair and brutal.
Yeah.
And what is the origin of their attitude towards women? What is the origin of that?
I mean, patriarchy.
It completely exists in Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best comparison I would say is to think about Christian nationalism, because when I look at Christian nationalism, I think it's about power. It's about being in control and having power. I mean, other people can chime in if you have other, but that's the way I see it. I see it as like wanting to be in control and sort of using the faith to kind of justify the things that you want, which is for men, for men to be in control. And I mean, I guess you could say it's Christian, it's Muslim, it certainly is, but
I have a question for Eric. In IS, which is your act, okay? Do you have Muslim students in IS?
Yeah, of course.
And do you find is there a division among the Muslim students themselves between people who are sort of like energized by feminism and people who are not energized by feminism?
Oh gosh, I couldn't speak for all the Muslim students. Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to how characterize all of the Muslim women, especially in our program, but certainly there's a lot of energy and conversations about, intersectional movements for justice and connecting international and American movements for women's rights. A lot of attentiveness to, the courage and bravery of women around the world, not just in Iran, but in Sudan and other places where women are leading peace movements that are at enormous cost to their lives.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of attentiveness to that, for sure. But we should have more conversations, bringing Muslim women together in our program to put some tangible flesh on that. But it'd be an interesting question.
One of your majors is right there.
I know.
Yeah.
Advising a student.
Yeah. No, that's a good point.
I have a question. Yeah, have you found that within these groups that people who identify with no religion, kind of they go with the cause that they are standing for, even though they're not? Like, is there, because there's, like, I mean, the younger population that identifies with no religion.
Yes.
Obviously, they have spaces because they definitely integrate within many different causes. That when you have is that what you found?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and it's actually kind of the area where I think I want to do more work on, is like the unaffiliated, spiritual but not religious. But yes, I definitely think you have connections, like especially in terms of like people who are interested in social justice activism. Like Blair Imani, people kind of seem to nod their head. I mean, young people know who she is. Most of her followers are not Muslim, even though she herself is Muslim. And I feel like most of her followers are more like kind of secular. I feel like woke now is like lost all meaning, but kind of people are interested in those issues, right? So certainly you have those connections. I think you do sometimes find a little bit of lack of relatability, maybe, because people are interested in supporting these causes but don't have the same personal experiences of, particularly like within evangelical Christianity. It's such a subculture that if you aren't really exposed to it, you maybe just don't really quite understand it, if that makes sense. So I think people are supportive of these movements but maybe don't really understand the way it's kind of is a culture that's really entrenched in people's lives. And with Islam as well, I think there's a similar kind of unique experience to being American Muslim that people outside of that may not experience it. But to say, though, a lot of people who are spiritual but not religious are former evangelicals or former, so they are exposed to that culture as well. But yeah, no, that's a good question about that intersection for sure. Yeah.
Kind of based off that, do you think maybe that being the follower basis is sort of where that like sexual ethic and like history of that gets lost, and it becomes more of just a like give them their freedoms rather than like
I definitely think there can be kind of a sort of a we're supportive but we don't really quite understand, like, and I think there is, just in general, I think there's a problem of like when people are leaving something like a faith tradition like that, they may not have actually like a foundation to build on something new, right? To build a community, to build a faith tradition, to build a sexual ethic that is based in something, right? I think that is problematic, right? That where are these people going? What's going to kind of support them? Yeah.
Kristin, you didn't show these videos, but I watched a couple of them, the early ones of women in a different dress, set to music, almost like a fashion show in a way. And there is an occasional message, but what really strikes you is the visual of all these great outfits and all these great looking women and everything. And it struck me as so tied up with material American culture that I had a hard time seeing it as a liberatory movement.
Yeah.
And do you have any?
So are you speaking of like the Mipsters video and stuff like that?
There's another one that's longer.
Yeah, so you're speaking to a bit of like some of the kind of internal debates I've had, right? Because on the one hand, I do feel strongly that fashion is an important political space, right? What people wear matters. It says something about who they are. It can be a statement, and I think that is a really important aspect. But you're absolutely right that it also can merge into being about the focus on appearance and consumption, right? So you have that as well. You definitely have a lot of, so the early years of Islamic fashion, a lot of what you saw was like kind of this celebration of like, you can be modest and modern, that's great. And then a lot of the discussion around it was sort of more moving into this idea of like critiquing the consumption of it, critiquing the focus on the body, critiquing this idea that Muslim women should just be seen and not heard, that they have no voice, like they have nothing to say. So then now I feel like now in the digital space, you have such a diversity of representations and discussions going on, and I think it has moved away from that. But yeah, you're definitely right that is a kind of common concern from outside the community, but also from within. And there has been more discussion and debate about like, let's create something a bit more productive. Let's talk about things. Let's let's do something more than just be kind of this visual image. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I had kind of a very similar question about Mona Hayder specifically, personally, because her self-presentation, her self-image seems to put forward this kind of fairly traditional or standard beauty image. Yeah. But in her videos, she does seem to have some techniques that sort of undercut or minimize that sort of self-presentation. So I was wondering if you could say anything about what her politics is around.
And also I found that same way with like Blair Imani and stuff, because it's like they in their work they're very critical of all these things, but then their appearance, like Mona is Arab, light complected, fairly attractive. So you could say, well, isn't she just doing the same? But I think she's really good about pushing up and supporting other women, right? And not making her videos and her work just about her own issues. She started making the hijabi video. She was inspired for it when she went to the protests in North Dakota about the pipeline. Like that was what inspired her. She was pregnant, as you can see she's pregnant in the video. So she's really, really active in other causes. She actually got a degree in Christian ethics because she was like really interested in like understanding what she calls like the Western imperialist ideas and stuff like that, right? So she's very engaged with other projects and really wants to like center other bodies and other experiences. So I would say she's pretty deliberate in that way. I find that. Blair Imani, I don't know. Her work is a bit of a challenge for me because she's I don't know. There's a lot of things about her work that I find challenging, and this kind of contemporary woke culture. But but there is this kind of tendency of like they're talking about really great activist stuff, but they're also like still about promoting their bodies and promoting consumption. Especially Blair Imani. She's still an influencer at the end of the day. She's still trying to sell stuff. So I don't know. She could keep talking about all these progressive things, but she's still trying to sell you things. Yeah. Yeah.
Are there male allies in these spaces?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. Well, the Alhamdu project's like the only one that actually has men involved in it, and yeah, so there are some male allies. Matthias Roberts in the Queerology, and then the host of Evangelical is Blake Chastain, who's a man. So yes, there are male allies in these projects, and definitely. Yeah, within the evangelical movement, stuff about the purity culture, men also often talk, in the comments about the harm that the culture puts on them, right? That there's a lot of pressure for them, and yeah, so there's a lot of harm in that way. Men have also been obviously victims of abuse as well, and so yeah, there are male allies in the project, Muslim men as well. Partly in the book, I kind of mostly focused on women because it made it a little bit easier to manage. But yeah, definitely. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm interested in methodology and demographics
Oh,
when it
yeah.
comes to your work.
That's great.
Are you finding that most of the influencers, and I'm sure it's like different person
Yeah,
to
sure.
person, are they targeting their content towards an audience that's more like inside the community?
Oh, right.
Or is it more general? Because I'm familiar, for example, with like Blair Imani's work,
Yes,
and I know
yeah.
that she kind of takes more of like a general education approach.
Mhm.
And then
Mhm.
also, are there any like platforms in particular, or any audience demographics in particular that you see as being like through lines or particularly relevant?
Right. Yeah, that's good. So, so the first question, it just depends. Like some of the podcasts, like the podcasts generally are sort of people within that community, but obviously you can't like restrict who listens to it, but they're very geared towards that community. Like even I listen to a lot of the Truth Table, and I was like looking up like Protestant theology stuff because I was like, I don't know what they're talking about in some of these things, because they go really in depth with that. And then let's see, within so the hashtag discussions, definitely people within that community, and that built out of a really active like private Facebook groups that were created around former evangelicals. So that was me, mostly people within that community. Podcast, mostly people within that community. And then with the videos, I think those are definitely for more of a wider audience because they're meant to be kind of distributed widely. And definitely meant for kind of people to kind of have connections from other aspects. Like Dog, I think, is a great video that relates to abuse experiences that doesn't necessarily have to be within Islam. And then the Instagram is interesting because, yeah, you're right. Blair Imani is definitely creating stuff for a larger audience, for kind of a larger progressive audience. Leah Vernon definitely too. I think it's sort of the way that they target themselves and how they position themselves. So she kind of attracts people who are interested in like body positivity, who are interested in Black positivity. But then I would say the Village Auntie, her work is definitely for a Muslim community, and she kind of positions it in that way. And I think it's a way how they position themselves. Like this is a space for Black Muslim women. If you're Christian and you're interested in these questions, you're welcome, but this is how I'm framing it, right? And then with Zainab, her stuff is definitely, she talks about this like Muslim Instagram, Bookstagram space where she's creating the work for that community. So yeah, it's a good point to think about. And then what was your second question?
I'm wondering what the role that platform plays in
right.
the methodology of this discourse. So, for example, like TikTok is very popular nowadays. Are you finding that with these activists, like I don't know if there's like a generational component to like what age an influencer is and like what their audience is and what platform they're utilizing?
Yeah, right. So now you're right. Like TikTok is like huge and everything's on TikTok. And in my class this semester, everyone is talking about XYZ. So it's like ex-Mormon, ex-Orthodox Jewish, ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. They're all on there on TikTok. It's like a huge thing right now. So yes, TikTok has become this huge space for younger Gen Z. And the stuff on there is so different than the stuff on Instagram, right? Like Instagram is much more of like my generation, it's like kind of like everyone's having children and like having these cute, the influencers are all having their children. And because I followed some of these influencers when they were on YouTube and they were all like young and now they're all married with children. And so like that's the older space. Podcast, I think, is an older space, right? I think it's a, Gen Y, Gen Xer space. The evangelical movement is definitely people raised in the 90s and 2000s. And so I think you're right. I think TikTok is the new space for these conversations. Yeah.
Do you think that's interesting that the focus to TikTok, that You mentioned that there, in certain podcasts, there is some significant theological debate going on.
Yes.
You don't really see a lot of that in what we've seen here. It's more cultural than theological. But are there theological discussions underpinning these things? And do you think that will be lessened as it shifts towards TikTok, which I don't think of as a great platform?
Yeah, I think it's definitely
theology.
There's not any depth to it, right? And I feel like there's this like these kind of easy critiques and easy space for this like kind of quick takes, but not a lot of depth. No, I don't think so. But I think the spaces of depth, like the YouTube videos, the podcasts, are still pretty prominent spaces that people are turning to. But you're right. I mean, and even Instagram is really becoming like TikTok, where it's like fast and stories and short slides. And in another project I look at, like Blair Imani does all these like 15-second, 30-second videos and these slideshows. And it's like, how can you distill something into 5 slides of text, right? You can't, you know? But that's the way everything is now, you know?
Please join me in thanking Kristin.
Thank you.
One of the many questions is who's going to play you in the made-for-TV movie? I want to also thank Susie Richard, who's our administrator, who ordered all the food. And to thank her, I have a terrible taste. She has wonderful taste in food. Do that. And if you would all please take a cupcake home. The mice will not like that, but we will be very grateful. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.